Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here. It's now 2 o'clock, so it's probably time to get started with this webinar organised by the International Institute for Sustainable Development and entitled Building a Connected World, the Critical Role of Digital Technical Standards. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us. My name's Alice Tipping, and I lead the Trade and Sustainable Development team at ISD, from whence this work comes. Let me give you perhaps a little bit of an overview of what we'll do today, and then introduce the speakers who'll walk us through the content, and then leave you time for questions at the end. So that everyone's aware, we'll be recording the first part of this webinar until the end of the presentations, but we will not be recording the discussion at the end of the presentation. So you can feel free to raise your hands or to write questions in the Q&A box as we go along. Those will not be part of the recording that we eventually publish on our website for other people's reference. So this webinar is essentially based around a policy brief written by Craig Atkinson, who's the founder and director of Lex Merca International Trade, and Dr. Hanan Besha, who's the vice chair of the UN CEFACT and senior international advisor on transport and logistics, innovation and standards. So Craig and Hanan have written for us a fantastic policy brief entitled I beg your pardon. So it's on digital trades, but it's part of a series that we have written of policy briefs entitled Building Blocks on Digital Trade Regulation. And the idea essentially is to try and provide for policymakers and stakeholders a series of policy briefs that cover the essential elements of regulation of digital trade. We've covered issues like cybersecurity and consumer protection already, and the idea of the development and the governance of digital trade standards was an incredibly important part of that. So maybe just an additional word about the topic. Many of you will be aware as policymakers or as stakeholders that the standards landscape, in particular for digital technologies, is evolving extremely quickly. And we have a complex interplay between private, public and multi-stakeholder standard setting bodies that are in different places and on different topics shaping international norms. For developing countries, this is an additional challenge given some of their capacity constraints, but the importance of the standards that are being set at the moment across digital technologies for digital trade make involvement and an effective engagement in these processes extremely important. So what we'll do for the next hour or so is that I'll invite Craig and then Hanan to talk us through the policy brief and what their research reveals about the landscape of the development of these standards, the challenges that developing country policymakers face in particular in understanding and engaging effectively in that landscape and in shaping it, and in the recommendations that their research provides about how developing countries could think about engaging in these different processes. I'll then invite Cindy Parakil, who is the AI Policy Lead and Capacity Building Program Manager at the International Standards Organization, based like us in Geneva, Switzerland, to talk from the ISO's own perspective about the challenges and opportunities facing developing countries in their engagement in international forums like the ISO, lessons that might have been learned from her perspective and those of different governments about what effective engagement could look like, and perhaps recommendations about how developing countries, both policymakers and stakeholders, can think about shaping their engagement in this very important, but sometimes quite invisible part of policymaking, nonetheless important. So we'll run through perhaps half an hour or so of both presentations and comments from Cindy, and then we'll have an opportunity to have questions and comments. You have two options. You can either wait until the presentations are finished and use the hand-raising function at the bottom of your window, or if you have questions as we go along, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A boxes at the bottom. And I've asked both Craig and Hanan and Cindy, if she wishes, to keep an eye on the Q&A box and answer in writing any questions that they feel able to do while we go along. That way we'll get hopefully through the maximum number of questions and provide as much value to you from the three experts who have very graciously given us some of their time to walk us all through this topic. So I think that's enough from me. Maybe the very last sort of piece of housekeeping and organizational point is that all of this work is funded by the Swedish International Development Agency, and we're very grateful for all of their support, without which, of course, this work couldn't have seen the light of day. So with all of the institutional points made, Craig, I think I'll pass over to you for the presentation between you and Hanan of the policy brief. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. And everyone can see my screen now? It's working?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Excellent. So I wanted to firstly say thank you to you, Alice, as well as to Rashmi Rashid and to the entire IISD team behind the scenes. There's been a lot of work that's gone into what we're presenting today, as well as the forthcoming IISD policy brief, which is titled Setting International Technical Standards to Shape Digital Trade Policy. I believe this is a unique publication in the sense that it focuses on how developing country stakeholders, particularly policymakers, can understand and engage with digital standardization efforts at the global level. One of the things that makes this a novel policy brief is that it doesn't really focus on the specific standards. It really does focus on that institutional engagement. And I hope that that brings value to various stakeholders, not just policymakers, but also micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that may also want to understand the nuts and the bolts, so to speak, of how international digital standardization takes place. So on that note, I will be presenting on context and creation, digital trade, and international technical standardization. So in this presentation, I will firstly define digital trade for the purposes of discussing international technical standardization. I will then describe what digital standards are and examine how digital standards are created. I will lastly explore different institutional approaches to develop and agree upon international standards and introduce the governance of digital standard setting via policy tools. So, for context, what is digital trade? We hear a lot about this term in various contexts, but there are actually several definitions of digital trade. They include statistical, legal, and administrative meanings. But for the purposes of this discussion, consider a simplified description of digital trade: the intentional application of digital technologies at any stage of the trade process. And it's also important to note that digital trade is reshaping patterns of economic growth and international development. Also, it's important to define what a standard is. So unfortunately, there's no universal definition of a standard. Different countries, regions, and organizations define standards in their own ways. However, generally, a standard can refer to rules, requirements, and guidelines for how technologies, products, and services are developed and function. It is important, however, to differentiate between the general use of the term standard and specific meanings. And at the multilateral level, in the context of trade and products, under Annex 1.2 of the WTO Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, standard is defined as a document approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use rules, guidelines, or characteristics for products or related processes and production methods with which compliance is not mandatory. Aside from these definitions, it's also important to understand the difference between national and international standards and differentiate between them. So in some contexts, a standard can mean a national regulatory measure, and at an international level, standards are really voluntary instruments. They are global and they do not belong to any one country. And certain organizations specialize in creating international standards. So those include the ISO and the IEC. And this presentation today will mainly focus on international standards. So moving on from the generalities about standards, it's important to talk about what are digital technical standards, the topic of this presentation today. Digital technical standards are rules, requirements, or guidelines for how digital technologies, mainly information and communication technologies, are designed and interact. These standards enable compatibility or interoperability between various devices and systems, as well as scalability and the wide adoption of digital technologies. And it's also important to note that digital trade depends on digital standards. They allow governments, businesses, intermediaries, and consumers to communicate and conduct transactions across borders using different devices, systems efficiently and at scale. And it's also possible to differentiate between two types of digital standards. So in one sense, there are general purpose or domain independent standards. And these can include electronic data or document formats generally, internet protocols, web standards, AI standards, and blockchain standards. So in this category, we're really talking about those general purpose standards that can be used in a variety of different use cases and contexts. And then there are also commerce related standards. And this is an area that Hanan will be speaking to quite a bit more, but these are really focused on domestic business or trade specific electronic documents, as well as systems for digital trade facilitation, et cetera. So the real difference here between these types of digital standards is that commerce related standards are specific to performing commercial and commerce related activities. And so also, aside from the fact that digital technical standards often focus on compatibility, i.e. interoperability, they can alternatively be understood in the sense of trust and security. There are a wide range of digital standards that are designed to support secure and trustworthy digital interactions and transactions. And these include standards for electronic authentication, e-signatures, data protection, and cybersecurity. And it's also important to note that the digital standardization landscape is highly fragmented, and there are a variety of different forms that have different approaches, priorities, and degrees of accessibility. And what's important for developing country policymakers and stakeholders to note that often participation involves balancing priorities for digital sovereignty with opportunities for integration into the global digital economy. And global powers are increasingly treating digital technical standardization activities as a tool to advance geopolitical influence, shape international norms, and anchor their positions in trade and technology-related negotiations. So how are digital standards created? There are really three different, there's a spectrum of formality through which digital technical standards emerge. The first level is what are known as informal, voluntary, or de facto digital standards or standards in general. These are developed through market-driven processes and achieve wide adoption, but there's no formal process for their adoption. These are famously, an example is the QWERTY keyboard format. Another level is the formal voluntary level or de jure standards. These are developed through international standards development organizations, SDOs, such as the ISO and IEC standards, and through defined processes often involving consensus. And lastly, there are mandatory, which are also de jure formal standards. These are government-imposed standards, typically through national law and regulation. And a good example is China's mandatory cybersecurity examples. So overall, this level of formality determines who participates and the level of inclusiveness in participation, and also whose interests are represented. So in terms of institutional approaches to standard setting, involving formal standards, the digital standardization landscape is very complex and it spans different approaches. So at one level, there are these private-led, often fee-based consensus-driven processes, which kind of map onto the different levels of formality that I just discussed. Secondly, there are also open development processes, ODPs, that use transparent, inclusive, and flexible multi-stakeholder approaches to enable participation across countries and industries. And lastly, there are government-led processes that either set mandatory top-down standards, as described with mandatory standards in the previous slide, or government processes that take the lead in voluntary efforts with industry. So aside from these institutional approaches, there are a variety of different types of international forums that develop standards. So at one level, there are the former international SDOs. These include ISO, IEC, and the International Telecommunications Union and its ITU study groups. These are collectively known as the World Standards Cooperation, WSC bodies. Secondly, you have tech-focused, technology-focused, or what are known as sometimes quasi-formal SDOs. And these include a variety of different organizations that focus on technology specifically. And then lastly, in this framing, you also have trade-related SDOs. And these are organizations that focus on international trade or domestic commerce. And they include CEFACT, the International Maritime Organization, and the World Customs Organization. And overall, we see a trend at the moment where there's increasing privatization and a trend towards those private quasi-formal SDOs in producing standards, as well as the role of the geopolitical influence of these voluntary, privately developed standards. And then there's also levels of governance when we consider how standards are governed themselves. So these are really rules about rules or rules about standards. And these really take place, these governance layers really take place at 3 levels. So at one level, we have the global or multilateral level that involves the WTO's coordination via its agreements, most specifically the TBT agreement and its 6 principles, the trade facilitation agreement, et cetera. And the majority of these agreements encourage the use of international standards. And increasingly, there's talks at the WTO level through the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce and the recently produced draft agreement on e-commerce that discuss various aspects of standards governance at that plurilateral level among a smaller group of members at the WTO. Secondly, we have a regional and bilateral level that must be considered, and this involves the traditional but modern take on preferential trade agreements or PTAs, as well as the new age, what are known as digital economy agreements and digital trade agreements. And then lastly, at a national level, we have competing strategies from the world's major powers that affect governance of standard setting at various other levels. And these include the strategies of China, the EU, and the US. Overall, what this amounts to and what the key takeaway is given these different layers is that this fragmented system complicates developing country stakeholder participation in international standardization efforts. So one of the key outputs of the WTO in the year 2000 was the so-called 6 principles for the inclusive development of international product standards. I'm not going to go through all of the various principles themselves, but they include transparency, openness, impartiality, effectiveness, coherence, and importantly for this conversation, a development dimension. In the bilateral to regional cooperation level, modern PTAs cover a variety of areas related to digital standardization, and some of those importantly are related to e-signatures and cybersecurity. Likewise, digital economy agreements and digital trade agreements are emerging as new generation tools for the governance of digital standards and trade. And one of the key examples of these new age agreements as a DEA is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or the DEPA, between Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, with South Korea joining in 2024. This agreement is a modular and flexible agreement and really supports inclusive participation, not only in the agreement itself, but in its various functions related to international digital standardization. And then lastly, at that national level, it's important to consider what are known as the 3 digital kingdoms through the framing of Henry Gao at Singapore Management University. So China takes a strategic priority that relates to security and maintaining sovereignty and control over its digital standardization efforts domestically, and then in its involvement in international agreements. And this is done through a state-centric, market-driven hybrid system. At the EU level, the strategic priority focuses on compatibility and security, and it often focuses on the trust and fundamental rights of the EU corpus of law and regulatory harmonization between EU members. And then lastly, at the considering the US, the traditional approach is focused on compatibility and a market-led, private sector-driven approach to standardization. And these diverging models compete to shape international standards and policy at the global level. So just as a sneak peek of what you'll see in the forthcoming publication, we've created a table of the various levels and examples of policy tools that are influential in governing international digital standardization. And then lastly, to conclude, there are a variety of policy implications for developing countries that emerge from this discussion. So most importantly, and as I mentioned before, there's a need to balance digital sovereignty with global interoperability and trust requirements. And this really produces three subpoints. Overall, there's a dominance by major powers as well as privately led forums that produce voluntary but essentially de facto compulsory standards. Secondly, there's a limited capacity of developing countries, creates risks that they become or remain standards takers as opposed to becoming standards makers. And lastly, I'll conclude with this, is that strategic engagement in particular forums and negotiations or agreements is key to the influence of developing country policymakers and the stakeholders that they represent. And I will conclude there, but I think Hanan will provide a nice takeoff in part 2 of this conversation to discuss more of the aspects related to the inclusion and other areas related to developing countries and international digital standardization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for this nice introduction covering all the different required definitions for my presentation. I'm very glad to be with you this afternoon. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hanan Besha. I am the founder and director of Digital Trade, independent consultant, and the vice chair of UN CEFACT for trade, for transport and logistics. Okay, today I'm going to talk about how digital technical standards can help us build a more connected, inclusive world, and why participation in these standards is critical, especially for developing countries and smaller players. So in terms of agenda, today we'll be explaining a bit why standards matter, why inclusion matters. We'll go through the barriers to participation. I will have one slide to explain how the UN CEFACT works in an open, inclusive manner. We'll try to go from challenges to action, from standards takers, users, to standards developers. Then shaping, not just following global digital standards, is very important. And I will end up my presentation with a short call to action. I will keep it practical and focused on what this means for policymakers, for industry, and experts. I think our main participants today. So why digital standards matter? Digital standards are not just a technical detail in the background, but they are really what is needed to make sure that we have interoperability, we have trust and scalability. They are embedded in trade agreements, influence market access, shape who benefits from the digital economy. So if you are not really at the table when standards are discussed, developed, very hard to make sure that these standards are aligned with your needs and with realities. And when we mention that there is a need to encourage inclusive participation and standardization, means that you really have a say on how data exchanges are defined, which technologies need to be adopted, and how open or closed future market will be. So I really see the standards as a passport to global digital trade. Okay. Why inclusion matters? Simply because inclusion in standards is not just about fairness, it's about performance, it's about resilience. And part of my work as vice chair of UN CEFACT is really encouraging small, medium enterprises to get involved in standards, women as well, and namely developing countries. The idea is to be able to develop standards that fit the need of different countries with more diverse views, background, needs. And the aim of standards is really to design a system that works in different realities, not only for a few advanced economies or countries. And when we build standards together, there is a greater trust between systems, stakeholders, and a better collaboration between different parts of the world. So when all voices are part of the process, digital transformation becomes truly global, not just globalization and open market for a few countries. I understand this is not very accessible. I understand that there is some barriers. I understand that some countries are not quite well represented in the standards development processes. So why many are still left out when we really want no one left out? Simply because still the participation is quite challenging for many countries and organizations. There is some challenges due to the fragmented landscape mentioned by Craig earlier. So different organizations working on probably what it could be seen as competing standards. Sometimes there is high membership fees or participation cost, including some travel. There is some capacity constraint when it comes to technical skills, when it comes to lack of time or resources to follow and contribute in different standards. And there is as well, let's face it, some representation issues, including language barriers, time zones, and sometimes even power imbalance in decision-making in these organizations. All this creates a standards gap, which will in turn deepen the digital divide between different countries, basically. I wanted to spotlight on the UN CEFACT because for me, UN CEFACT offers a different model, a more inclusive model. So UN CEFACT is United Nations Center of Trade Facilitation with the mandate really to facilitate trade. So we develop different standards, and these standards are really open, transparent, free to use, free to download. You don't even need a password to get access to this standards for digital trade facilitation. We use what we call open development process, which means anyone can join, contribute, and access to the deliverables, and making the standards publicly available. And the standards are really designed to meet the global requirement defined by different stakeholders, basically, covering public and private sector. So, and it's very important to this call to make sure that different developing countries become standards maker, because it's really about sustainable development goals. So if we are not enhancing and working with all parts of the world, it won't really have the impact which is desired by this process. So open, inclusive, and supportive of developing economies. This is what we have in UN CEFACT. I would like to encourage the participation in UN CEFACT, but not only. Personally, I'm involved in different organizations, IMO, International Maritime Organization, ISO, and we have our colleagues on this call with us. So it's not really about UN CEFACT, but UN CEFACT simply, for me, exemplify a bit what could be easily accessible organization for developing economies, as simple as that. On this slide, I'm simply highlighting that there is a need to move from challenges to action, and we need to close this standardization gap. And for me, there is 4 different or 5 different steps to follow. First of all, you need to engage. You really need to identify and monitor the relevant standards development organizations, whether it's ISO, whether it's CEFACT, whether it's IMO, whether a different one. It's really about what is really needed for your work. It's really the organizations working on the topic that impact your activities and your digital agenda. That's the main focus, not necessarily a particular organization. Definitely, you have to prioritize open and transparent processes, because this kind of development model make it easier in terms of access, in terms of cost, in terms of all these barriers that we did mention earlier. The third point is really the building capacity. It's very, very important to invest in technical trainings. It's very important to invest in tools. It's very important to have some help, some support to understand the landscape, which is very highly fragmented. This is what really I have seen, witnessed, especially in developing countries that trying to catch up with the digital trade, with using the digital tools, with adopting standards, etc., as a tool for to become more competitive. I think it's very important as well to highlight the need to collaborate. So once you are willing to collaborate, once you are willing to influence international standards, it's very important to have regional alliances. It's very important to see how at your own region you could share resources, you could coordinate positions with the aim to increase impact. And to amplify the participation, there is a need to encourage participation from industry, small, medium enterprises, women, academia. It's very important to enrich the perspective on how to participate. Okay. So I think you got it. My main message, again, it's really shaping the standards, not just adopting or following the standards. Usually I am more into promoting standards adoption. For this particular focus, my main message is really countries and organizations should not only adopt the standards, they should also help shaping them. For this, there is a need to act strategically, taking into account the limited resources, taking into account that we have many organizations and many topics to be covered. Choose the one that really matters for your priority, for your sector, for your country, for your digital roadmap. Act collectively. It's very important to collaborate, cooperate, to have a stronger position, a stronger voice in these international forums, and be really practical. We don't really just go to develop standards. We really try to have a concrete task force locally or within the organizations to make sure that these standards are really useful. They are meant to help the strategy. So we talk a lot about pilots. We talk a lot about task force, engaging public-private sector. It's really to make sure that you are working on standards that really matter for your organization or your digital roadmap, national digital roadmap. The following is my latest slide, which is really important to highlight. Inclusive standards are the backbone of an inclusive digital economy. As simple as that. So broader participation leads to fairer digital markets and more resilient systems. It's a win-win from the different part of the world. The decisions we make now about who participates in standardization will shape who sets the digital rules of tomorrow and who could be taking part of this market. And again, my call to action is very simple. You have to get informed about the standards that impact you. You have to get involved as much as you can. You have to prioritize open processes that have open, transparent, inclusive way of working. And the aim is really to make standards as a force for inclusion and not exclusion. The idea is really to offer a new opportunity for developing countries using standards as a powerful tool and not as a gap, especially when it comes to trade agreement, as mentioned earlier by Craig. Thank you very much for listening. This was my latest slide.
Thank you, Hanan, and thank you both to you and Craig. I thought that was really fascinating. And Craig, thank you for outlining for us the variety of different technical standards we're talking about, the general application ones, the ones that relate specifically to trade, the different methods by which standards are created and the different levels of governance and the particular challenges that developing country policymakers and stakeholders and the rest of us need to be aware of as we look at this overall policy landscape. And Hanan, I found a lot of what you said, frankly, very inspiring, right? And actually very insightful. The fact that we talk a lot about digital trade and its inclusion, but looking beyond just the digital gap and the skills gap into the standards that make the technologies work together or not, I thought was extremely important. So I'm going to be stealing a number of those lines. I thought they were really inspiring and quite insightful. So thank you very much indeed to both of you. I thought that was a great summary of the policy brief, into which I know a lot of work has been put. It's not easy to make these very technical issues accessible, but I think we've managed that. And so Cindy, you're at the forefront of a lot of this, the process of explaining standards to the rest of the world and of helping to make sure their development is inclusive. What are the key things you'd like our audience to bear in mind as they think about these issues from your perspective and your experience?
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel, both to you and Rashmi. And let me congratulate Craig and Hanan for their paper. It's very, very insightful. Thank you for capturing all these points very nicely. So I'll pick up on quite a few points that they made, particularly regarding the participation in international standardization. We know that participating in standardization provides a lot of benefits to both the public and private sector, from market access to development to consumer protection, trust, etc. But participating in international standardization has become very much a strategic priority for countries who want to seek benefits from the digital economy, which is why it's important to have all countries around the table. And that is one of ISO's strategic priorities, which I'll talk about a bit later. And as Craig and Hanan mentioned, as AI and cybersecurity and cloud computing, IoT, etc., are moving at such a pace, regulators are finding it difficult to regulate these, fast-moving technologies. So international standards are very important because they can move faster than regulation. They can complement regulation. International standards can be referenced in regulation, and international standards are increasingly shaping market access, interoperability, technology governance, and so on. But as we heard, the reality, which I also very much see because I work in the capacity building at ISO, is that developing countries really face real barriers that limit meaningful participation. And based on our experience, we see both challenges, but also practical solutions. And most importantly, really highlighting on the last point Hanan made, is broad collaboration across government, standards, private sector, and international organizations. So to complement what has been said, over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll introduce the ISO system and how it operates, just so that people have a better understanding. I'll highlight 5 key challenges that developing countries face when it comes to standardization, and share some of the examples of how we are addressing these gaps, and conclude with a few recommendations. So ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. We are a network of 175 standards bodies. So we have one member per country, and they are appointed by government as the national standards body. They're not necessarily part of government. They could be arm's length, but they are at least recognized as the standards body of the country. And we at ISO, we're a non-governmental organization. So that's also something to stress. And our job is to primarily create international standards that are voluntary. And we cover standards across the spectrum, from food to environment to technology, etc. And our system, when I'd like to describe it, I think about 3 key pillars. 1, our members, so the national standards body. They represent ISO at the national level and convene national stakeholders. 2, technical experts. So they are the ones who actually develop and write the standards in the technical committees. So technical committees are the forums where these standards are developed. And then we at the Central Secretariat based in Geneva, we coordinate the standards development process and provide that platform to enable that. So at ISO, we have 3 key priorities. ISO standards used everywhere. ISO standards meet global needs. And very importantly for this discussion, it's all voices heard. Our membership comprises of 175 members, and 127 are developing countries. So that's around 73%. So you can imagine how much emphasis we put on making sure that developing countries participate in the standards development process. And this is also very much in line with the WTO TBT6 principles, where development dimension is such a critical aspect. And from a governance perspective, at ISO, we have the DEFCO committee. So that's the Policy Development Committee on Developing Country Matters. So at the council level, at the most strategic level, we really want to take on board what our developing country needs and provide capacity building to support developing countries actively participate and use international standards. So bottom line, our members are essentially the strength of our system. They, at the national level, have such an important role to play because they represent ISO. They have to convene national stakeholders. So this is private sector, public sector, academia, civil society, and provide input into the standards development process that is taking place at the international level. So there is that strong link. And if people want to participate in standards development, look out for your NSB, reach out, participate. But I'll get to some of the challenges. And when it comes to technology, a key technical committee that I'll flag is our joint technical committee with our sister organization, IEC. It's the ISO IEC JTC1, which is on information technology. And there, if you look at participation data, we see that we have 51 countries who participate, they're participating members, and 26 are observers. So that's around 62% of our membership. And this shows how that there is both interest, but there's uneven capacity to engage in standardization. So I just wanted to leave that, and I'll now focus on what are some of the key challenges that developing countries face in standardization. So often there is limited understanding of the value of standards. And this is across the board, be it public sector, private sector. There's a bit of misconception on voluntary standards, mandatory standards. So a lot of my work is demystifying this and sharing the value of international standards to different stakeholders. Often they're perceived as technical documents, but they are actually strategic tools for trade, competitiveness, consumer protection, and soft power. So raising awareness is crucial because these standards literally influence everything from AI to 5G, data privacy, etc. So we respond to this need of raising awareness through capacity building programs that help members connect with policymakers, regulators, also build the capacity of members, because in the digital space, that's also new. It's a new area. So we really put a lot of resources in raising their understanding and knowledge so that they can pass this on and talk about the level of the standards that are available to address policy needs. So we develop policy briefs, we offer capacity building workshops, but it's really to build that bridge between standards bodies and standards users, be it policymakers or governments. A second challenge I'd highlight is a lack of prioritization and strategic focus. So we know technology is cross-cutting, it touches on all sectors, and digital standardization is broad, it's fast-moving, and without a national strategy, participation becomes fragmented and reactive rather than having a holistic approach. So there's, challenges can include no clear prioritization on which committees to join, because there are many in the ISO world. I mean, let alone ISO, there's so many other forums, right? Weak coordination across ministries, as digital is so cross-cutting. Standards are not integrated into national standardization strategies, and no systematic process for forming national positions on, what they think the contribution should be. So there are many committees, I'm not going to list them, but there's like for AI, there's 42, cloud computing 36, quantum, you name it, we have standards for everything. So what we do to support this is help our members work with governments to develop national standardization strategies that are in line with government priorities so that things move in a aligned manner and priorities can be set for a number of years, providing that clarity and clear framework. And of course, if that clarity is there, funding will follow. Challenge 3, I would say, is limited technical and institutional capacity, particularly in the digital space. There's lack of pool of experts. National standards bodies may not have digital units, so we offer technical assistance based on whatever the needs that have been identified, be it to engage these different stakeholders from different circles so that they can effectively contribute to the standards development process. For financial and resource constraints are another challenge. Active participation in many technical committee obviously means funding issues, time issues, travel, the ability to also review these extensive technical documents. And especially if you don't have that technical expertise in-house or in your country, then you can't meaningfully participate. You can just tick off the box of participation. And once the why is clear, it becomes easier to justify funding, as I said, because you have an understanding of what it is that you want for because you're participating in a committee. So if you're participating in a committee, you need to know what it is that you want for your country, for your stakeholders, etc. So some of the recommendations we can give is that countries can first join a committee as a observer member rather than a participating member. So the commitment required is not as much as a participating member. We also, through donor funding, provide sponsorship for developing countries to participate in some priority standardization activities. For example, through the support of the Australian government, we had one project where we supported 12 South Asian countries to participate in technology-related technical committee meetings. And they brought the national standards body, but also either a public sector person or a private sector person to help make sure that this knowledge is not just with the NSB, but with stakeholders, and this helps that knowledge transfer. And yes, of course, another challenge is uneven digital infrastructure, because we have tried to lower participation barriers through having certain meetings online, etc. However, the reality is very much that there's unstable internet, electricity supply is not there all the time consistently in developing countries, etc. So these are challenges that are very real and limit participation. So to summarize, like, what kind of support do we give? And we very much partner with other agencies to work together to support developing countries in a systematic and sustainable manner. So one, we support with the National Standardization Strategy, really helping countries set that multi-year priorities aligned with their government priorities. We provide support to increase participation through different mechanisms. As I mentioned, we offer capacity building to really raise that profile of standards and why they matter. And we also offer policy briefs, workshops, etc., as I mentioned. So looking at it from a policymaker perspective, I think what's very important is now that AI or technology strategies, acts, etc., regulations are being developed, they should consider standards and quality infrastructure right at the outset and start incorporating that. And also identify what are the roles for regulators, NSBs, right? No one's trying to get into each other's territory, but it's having those clear delineations so that we can work together. Then I would recommend to policymakers to work with standards bodies. Standards bodies can offer various insights across the policymaking life cycle. And by working together, I mean, we can achieve great things. So I would very much recommend that. And just on the TBT agreement, right? It is the only multilateral agreement that talks about standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment. And it says regulators can reference standards in technical regulations, right? So let's work together and sort of make that a reality. And then invest in national expert communities. So engage with research institutions, really grow that economy, reflecting your national priorities and the standardization strategy, and just greater collaboration between regions as well, especially in the digital space, because everyone's in a similar boat. I mean, we're all learning, we're all trying to figure it out. So there's so much one can learn from each other. So yeah,
that's great.
Let me leave it at that. Thank you, Alice.
No, Cindy, that's been fantastic. And listen, I should say, this is the first webinar I've ever sat in where little hearts have appeared floating up from the bottom of the screen as people spoke. So this is fantastic. I feel also that we've gone through this through the last few minutes to a space where we've started by understanding the standards out there, why they're important, why they matter, why their development and the process of their development and inclusion along that process matters, how challenging it can be, specifically for developing countries, but also, thanks to you, Cindy, the sorts of technical assistance that's available to meet some, probably not all, but meet many of those inclusion challenges, particularly for developing countries. So it's been a really nice, coherent picture of both of challenges and opportunities and solutions. So thank you.